Hello, Serena.
Hi, Anna Marie. You have a very interesting background there. It's not a virtual background, I take it.
No, since you and I know each other through self-employed circles, self-employed PhD, I wanted to give you a glimpse at sometimes the life of a self-employed person takes you to interesting locations.
Definitely interesting.
Yeah.
So, what's the story with your background?
Oh, this is my housemate's taxidermy. He calls this the game room.
That's great. I love it.
Yeah, I'm gonna stop video for 1 second. I'm gonna go. I don't want to let them be the stars of the show. You're the star of the show.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
over here in another part of the game room where it just looks like well, I don't know what it looks like. A different corner of the game room over by the window.
Yes.
So thank you for agreeing to sit down and talk to me over the campfire, as it were. Yeah, maybe that's why I was feeling the like rustic
It
camp.
does feel like there should be a campfire down there in that dungeon game room.
Yeah, the cabin feel of the campfire experience. But yeah, I find myself talking about you a lot. Just this past Monday, I was giving a workshop with students at Boise State, and students are very fired up about language activism and language advocacy, and I find myself telling your story. So I figured that I would give them access to the direct story
Yep.
and summoned you to the campfire. So I appreciate your making the time just before a long weekend.
Of course.
But,
Yep.
In these days of quarantine, a long weekend sort of is more of a notion than.
Yes, that's definitely true. Well, you mentioned one of the things about, excuse me, being self-employed is that, you don't know where you're going to be. Now, I'm in my home office, which I have set up exactly for video conferencing because the rest of the office is an absolute disaster. But this one, this spot I can make look
Very
quite,
studious corner. Yeah.
yes, quite bare and
Bookish.
nice. And so one of the things that's fun about being self-employed is you do move around. At least my job, I'm constantly moving around under normal circumstances. And so I don't know where I'm going to be. But when I'm working at home, my home office, I often have a child barge in on me. And that has been sort of not very kosher up until everybody has been
Yeah.
sheltering in during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then suddenly that becomes something that is expected, accepted.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting how the work style that I already had before we were all sheltering in has become much more accepted.
Yeah, what is strange is now normal.
Mm-hmm.
I was watching a storytelling show last night, and cats are jumping on people, and so one of the storytellers was like stroking her cat, and then the next storyteller, he had his like 18-year-old son, he was stroking his head like, well, you all have your loved ones.
Yep.
The poor kid was looking at the camera like, oh god, the things I do.
Which, that's, I mean, there are some moments of professionalism, I suppose, that, there are some limits, but everyone is different.
It's funny.
And advocacy is, one of those areas that is totally kind of all over the place. Some people that are in sort of activistic roles are quite, we'll say, like, live alternative lifestyles in terms of considered, within that set of prototypical professionalism.
Well, so tell us what it means. What does it mean to you? What is your life as a language, or activism professional? What's the space that you've carved out for yourself?
Well, it's interesting. So there are two key, so I have what's called the Language and Heritage Institute, and the Language and Heritage Institute sort of has two key words in it. One is language and one is heritage. And language has to do with linguistics, but also beyond linguistics and language in general. I am trying to reach the general population, and the word language is a very general word that will capture and reach a whole lot wider audience than linguistics does. We do a lot of linguistics work, so I try and support, and the work of the Institute does support a lot of scholarship, particularly junior scholarship in linguistics. But the purpose for that is because we are working for people who speak languages. And that's where the heritage part comes in, because most people who are involved in linguistics will think of heritage languages, languages that are spoken by people who learned it kind of growing up in perhaps a home atmosphere, family atmosphere, or informally. Often people don't learn to read and write primarily in their heritage language, but that varies widely. And so, yes, heritage language is definitely connected, but heritage in general has a lot to do with history, has a lot to do with family, has a lot to do with cultural heritage, the things that are passed down for us. And so that is also what I'm trying to capture there. So issues that affect people, that are language issues, particularly that affect families, that affect multi-generations, could be issues of revitalization. It could be issues of maintenance, language heritage maintenance. It could be things like, trying to push public policy, like language policy. So all of that is kind of encompassed in the Language and Heritage Institute.
And what's a typical project, if there is such a thing as a typical project?
There isn't really a typical project, or it has varied. Institute's only been around a couple of years, and the projects from time to time will be based on what sorts of things, first of all, our funding. So it depends on our funding. It depends on who's applying for our funding. And whether, we have our scope and criteria, of course, but that really, depends on, there are always way more qualified people than there are places to be able to support. So that has varied widely. We have a couple of papers that have come out, one in the intersection between public health and linguistics, and that has to do with women's forums, like health forums online, when people would go online and talk about their health problems. And it's a corpus study. We have another article that is, again, a corpus study, but this time about classroom language. So these sort of institutions, the healthcare institution, the institution of education, are those institutions that greatly affect humans, but particularly families over generations. And so that's the kind of work that we really want to support.
And I start to see how this then connects to your the other aspect of your work in genealogy.
Yeah.
Maybe
so
you could tell us about that.
Sure. So some people that say that, when people ask me what I do, often when somebody says, "What do you do?" they're not looking for a long explanation. And just like when we were working on our PhDs, we would not spend 20 minutes explaining our dissertation research to people.
And
I will never,
4. Yeah.
Exactly. I will never forget meeting up with Mary Buckles in a salad bar once at a conference, and we were moving down the salad bar line. And I could measure the amount of time, because she asked me, I said, "It's nice to meet you. I use your work in the classes that I teach. I absolutely love your articles." And she said, "Thank you. What are you writing your dissertation about?" And I could measure how many minutes. It was probably going to be between, say, 45 and 90 seconds that I needed to get spit out, right?
What'd you say? Do you remember?
I think I did pretty well. I think I said something like along the lines of looking at the identity creation between couples who tell narratives about their weddings. And I use both mixed sex and same sex couples. And she said, "Wow, sounds fascinating," which, I mean, probably anybody would say, but I think it was genuine. And
nice.
we were able to also do our well, it's good talking to you. You too. We'll talk later. All right, bye. And by the time we got to the salad bar, we were about right there, which was perfect. And she went off to her table with all the important people, and I went off to my table with graduate students.
I had a poor thing. I don't think she chose this. It was a N-Wave conference, and we ended up sharing a taxi to the airport. So I was like, 45 minutes with Mary Buckholz. I think I talked too much about my dissertation. So you told us how it's done.
So when people ask, what do? I know now. I have a sentence prepared. And I tell them, I'm a business owner and academic researcher. And I leave it at that.
Huh.
If the person is interested in knowing more, they will ask a follow-up question. If they're not interested in knowing more, I've given them a pretty big overview because I have two companies, well, two organizations. One's a company, that's Chronos Heritage Services, and that's my genealogy and genealogy travel company. And the other is an organization for language advocacy work, both activistic work and research, and that's the Language and Heritage Institute. So Chronos Heritage Services is completely different in many ways. And some people go, that is absolutely crazy that you do two different things. You have sort of like a split, person. And I go, no. They're all interconnected, right? And that is because it is my dream. And I think there are a lot of people out there who love multiple things, right? Who have a love of learning, who
multi-potentialites.
A little of everything. I consider myself a multi-potentialite in the Emily Wapnick sort of.
You're a
style.
the slash identity.
The slash identity is, if anybody's read Emily Wapnick's book, it's about multi-potentialized people that really are talented in multiple things and cannot just choose a single thing to do for the rest of their lives. And I think that our current sort of career society today is sort of supporting the multi-potentialite, the gig economy for sure.
Moving that way.
Kind of, has moved that way. But even for, our generation of having, 3 or 4 major careers, having a career change even is more acceptable now.
You and I know each other through Jen Polk, so you will appreciate this. I was looking at another interview you did with her back in the day, and she has Emily Wapnick.
Mm-hmm.
The book is over her shoulder, and I think that's it's just like you're talking about, right? It's there if somebody wants to ask, because it's a very distracting book cover. It's a book cover that grabs attention.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's just always available as a topic, it's a way she signals that's something that she's always willing to talk about.
Yeah. And I think I have talked about that book with Jen. So there you go.
Yeah.
And the book sort of is supposed to make you feel better about yourself if you're multi-potentialite. And so that book actually made me feel better about joining these two things together.
Yeah.
That I want to do two things. I don't just want to do, genealogy and genealogy travel. And I don't just want to be, just a professor and just do linguistics teaching and research. No, because I have all these other things that I want to involve. And so by doing these two things, I have been able to pull together some of the major values that I think form a lot of who I am, what I care about, into a single career.
What are those values, Serena?
We're laughing because we were just talking about these values a couple of weeks ago. So again,
Serena
Jen Polk.
You introduced, well, I guess you could tell a story.
Yeah, it was Jen Polk that actually taught me about those values. She introduced me to this idea that your values for what you care about, sort of like positive psychology, so to speak, where it's not about what's wrong with you, it's about what's right with you. And so my values are what's right with me. Like, these are my strengths, so to speak, but strengths in terms of speaking of the things I care about that are good for society, right? And so what do I care about that's good for society? I have a very strong curiosity for learning. I have a love of learning. It's more than just wanting to go read a book. I have 3 master's degrees. right? I have, half a PhD that I started and it ended up fizzling out and I did another PhD, but I'm not afraid to dive into things. So this
Wow.
is a sort of systematic love of learning and a curiosity for um, diving into creative projects. I'm a very creative person, even though I don't consider myself an artist. I think there are other ways of being creative.
Mm-hmm.
And having your own business is creative.
Mm.
Also, genealogy and genealogy research, you write a lot of narratives. A lot of it's very factual, it's very social sciencey, but at the same time, you are creating threads, stories, narratives for people about their families that are going to really touch them. And you get to design that yourself.
Mm. I was writing it down, so I made sure I didn't forget it. When you said having your own business is creative, um, I wonder if does that spark a memory? Can you take us to a specific time when you kind of got to be creative?
Sure, I can talk about one.
Mm-hmm.
So let's see. Well, one of the very first travel experiences that I provided a client was actually for my father.
Oh,
So
wow.
he wasn't a client. He didn't know he was a client. So when I was starting the business, I graduated in 2015 with my PhD in linguistics. In 2016, I formed Chronos Heritage Services. And I worked really hard at basic genealogy for a long time, trying to get accepted into the field. And one of the things I learned was that you have to have a niche. And finding my niche was the part that was creative. I loved being in charge of study abroads when I was a professor. And I taught in a Spanish department. And so one of the things that I absolutely loved was taking students abroad and demonstrating for them how we could interact as foreigners in a very purposeful and compassionate way, where we were sharing who we were and also enjoying experiencing these people who spoke this language that we were studying. Love that. I found a way to do that through genealogy by taking people on journeys to walk in the footsteps of their ancestors. And when I first started developing this, I knew I needed to try it out. I needed a prototype, right? And so I called my dad one day and I said, "Hey, Dad, will you fly to Connecticut with me?" And of course, my dad, I don't know that he's ever flown anywhere with me since I've been an adult. And he said, "Well, sure, but why?" And I said, "Oh, well, I've got to take my daughter, who was 4 at the time, on this business trip of mine. And so I want you to watch her while I'm, doing my work during the day." And he said, "Why don't you just drop her off at my house?"
Right.
And she's like, "I could take off work and just watch her for a few days." And I said, No. I've missed her a lot because I've been traveling a lot." And that is true. I actually do travel a lot, and it's hard when you have a family to travel as much as I do. So he eventually gave in. I bought the plane tickets. I got the hotel for us. And indeed, for the first 3 days, he and my daughter got to play together at our little apartment that we'd rented. And I went out and did my business. And then I had 2 extra days on the end of this business trip. And I took my dad. And this is where we get to creativity, right? Sorry it took so long to get there.
No, it's spellbinding.
So I said to my dad, "I'm going to show you." And I must preface this by saying my dad was a business owner and had a few businesses of his own during his life. Well, he's still alive, so he's retired now, but has had a few businesses. So he's a successful entrepreneur. So I said, "I want to show you," which is feeling a little vulnerable because he is successful at this stuff. And I said, "Come with me and I will, demonstrate this." We go to the Farmington River. I hand him a document. It is a baptismal record from the 1500s, I think late 1500s. And I said, if you look very closely, of course, you have to go through and find in the handwriting, the name of this person. This person was born in this particular place in England. And then I tell this long story, eventually getting to the point where he leaves. He escapes his glove maker apprenticeship and gets on a boat and comes out, and he would have sailed up, and here's where the place that we're at is important. He would have sailed up the Connecticut River, eventually the Farmington River, to this spot right here, and I point across the river to him. And I say, you know, this community was set up right here. And I point to the buildings around, and there's like a Home Depot or something. And I say, where that Home Depot is, he had a warehouse after he became successful.
Whoa.
He was involved in the trade. And then I say, let's get back in the car. I drive him to another point. I say, here's where public executions in this town would have taken place. He actually, pull out another document. He actually testified, and this person here was put in the pillory, and people threw, you know, vegetables at their face or whatever. And they have there, in this particular place in Windsor, you know, this green where this would have taken place. And so we get to read the little historical monument. So I take him from place to place to place. I took him to what was formerly a revolutionary prison that was on top of a copper mine, and it turned out one of his ancestors had mined copper and was actually minting coins, which was, of course, against the crown. And so it was a big deal. And these coins, and my dad's a coin collector. These coins today, there's a few that still exist, and I was able to pull them up off these auction sites, hand him this piece of paper and say, here is what they go for today, you know, 100,000, 250,000. And of course, my dad's just like, give me that. I want to see that. You know, he's like, you can see the wheels turning in his head. Dad, you're not going to buy a copper from the 1700s, but okay, it's cute. Finally, at the end of this day, we go to all these different places, and I'm putting together the local history of the area, the history of this person, and eventually his descendants. Particularly focusing on his sons and his wife's family. And we get to the graveyard at the end of the day, and we get to his grave. And it took us a while to find the grave. And, you know, my daughter's in tow, so there's this feeling of, you know, this family journey. And we get to the gravestone, and my dad is looking at it. I said, there it is, born here, died. There's an American flag, which is, you know, an anachronism because he died before it was the United States. But, you know, it's kind of something that people do out here because they think it's really important to recognize some of these early settlers. And my dad is just, I could see almost, even though I couldn't see them, right? You could tell he had goosebumps. You could tell that he was just loving this. And I said, so that is where our story ends for now, right? And I said, and I tell this cute story about 4 generations later, this woman who is the descendant, you know, 4 generations after, meets one Benjamin Williams, and Electa and Benjamin Williams marry. They go to the Ohio Territory, and she's the first school teacher in the Ohio Territory, and Benjamin Williams is our direct ancestor, the Williams line. So I hand my dad a piece of paper, and I have from this guy who left this apprenticeship with the glove maker, all going all the way down to my dad's name, to my name, to my daughter's name, right? And I hand him that, and I say, so here's here's how it all works out. And he just said, well, I'll be damned. That was his reaction. Now, my dad's not a very emotive person. So that was like, oh. When we got back to our little apartment, and we stayed up till 2 a.m, he was asking me, so what's your business plan, and show me your strategy, and what's your marketing look like? And I thought,
And you can hang because you have an MBA, right?
I do, but having an MBA is not the same as having a successful business. Anybody in business can tell you that. And in fact, anybody who's interested in starting their own business, they ask sometimes if they should get an MBA, and my answer is usually no.
Why?
MBAs are all about networking opportunities. Yes, you learn some valuable things that are helpful practically for business, but those are things you can also learn on your own.
So the networking for you wasn't the right kind of networking.
It's not the right kind of networking. If you want to get an MBA in your local area where you want to start your business, where you are going to be working with classmates who are also starting their own businesses, or professors who might be able to give you leads or help you out, then it might be useful to you.
I can see that, yeah.
A lot of people that already have entry-level positions who are given the opportunity to move up in their career, if they have an MBA, that's a good reason to get an MBA.
Mm-hmm.
But I wouldn't say get an MBA because you want to start a business. No.
Do you think having an MBA has shaped how you think about your business, or would you say having your linguistics training, it's not about
It's
more?
funny you say that. Business changes. Business
Uh-huh.
changes. Like the world of business changes so fast that the
Mm.
education is outdated. And I'll give you an example. When I got my MBA, it was like somewhere around 2007. And in 2007, when I took marketing, it was all about
Oh
sending
yeah,
pieces of paper to people
sure.
in mail, advertising in newspapers, or if you wanted to be really
Mm.
savvy, advertising online in online newspapers.
So
Right?
it's just
Uh,
cutting edge.
I mean, yes, some of the online advertising did exist, but it really was, yeah, that was, it wasn't a
Mm.
huge deal in 2005, 2006, 2007 like it is now. Nothing about social media marketing existed at that time. And so that's just an example with
Yeah,
marketing. I mean, when
sure.
you're talking about things like inventory control or sales strategies,
Oh,
it, it,
that's changed. You're
it
right.
has changed so much. So I guess for the general theoretical ideas that inventory control is a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And what can we learn from inventory control? That inventory is one of those things that uh, we waste a lot of money because we buy too much of something because we want to have it available for our clients.
Yeah.
And it's true with, I mean, it's not just true with inventory like you're going to sell, it's true with supplies, right?
Right.
I see something, I do a lot of paper printing. As you can imagine, a lot of what I do for people is provide them paper reports.
Mm-hmm.
As much as people
Booklets.
love the digital stuff too, the paper report is
Something about
tangible.
touching a book. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I do a lot of printing, and I will buy supplies sometimes in bulk going, oh, it's going to be cheaper if I buy 3,000 pieces of this colored paper. And then the cat walks on it and it gets dusty, and then like a book shoves up against half the paper and is bent, and like, no. So yes, my MBA taught me not to buy the 3,000 pages of paper in bulk because I learned the theoretical ideas of inventory control. No, don't get an MBA.
Hmm. So tell me then how your linguistics training, you talked about having a niche in the genealogy world.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean,
Yeah, was linguistics my niche?
yeah.
I thought it might be. It's not necessarily true. There is kind of a subfield of genealogy that's like genealogy translation. So that
Mm.
kind of connects a little bit with linguistics. There are some applications of linguistics to genealogy, but I was never able to really find the niche exactly in linguistics. Like I don't walk around calling myself the linguistics genealogist or something like that. And some of those applications are things like understanding what codex is. Codex is this really interesting technology that allows you to search for people's names and indexes by putting a name in and having the system substitute vowels for other
Uh,
vowels so that it searches a little broader in case there are transcription errors
yeah.
or alternative spellings and things like that.
When you
So yeah,
translate names. Yeah.
exactly. So if you understand that kind of stuff, I think it helps. But again, that's not that hard for somebody who hasn't had a linguistics background to understand either.
Hmm.
I will tell you one area that my linguistics training does help a lot and did, and this is a very specific example, and that is the work that I did for a client whose ancestor was from the former Austria-Hungary Empire, so the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this guy reportedly spoke German, said he was Hungarian, but other times said he was Austrian. And so I had read Susan Gall's article about how Hungarian men can't get wives. And it was because the article's about this, Austria Hungary border area that's called Burgenland, and it turns out that's where this client's family was from, where these women, and this was a modern, we're talking about contemporary Austria and Hungary now, where
Uh,
farmers have harder lives than people that live in urban areas do. People that live in the urban areas tend to speak more German. People that live in the countryside tend to speak Hungarian in these border communities. And so when it comes to language as social capital, many women in these areas were choosing to focus more on their German. So what do I know about that article that was applicable? Well, this guy's reporting that he's, speaks German, or even sometimes other people wrote that he was German, which of course is a bit of an error, but I can see how that might have happened in the early 20th century.
Well,
The
and
guy speaks German, you call him German.
did it also tip it off for you that there were certain contexts where German was the reported language?
Well, yeah, sometimes he reported that he spoke German, other times he reported that he spoke Hungarian. Well,
Yeah.
guess when he reported that he spoke Hungarian? During World War I.
Aha.
And then
Okay.
again during World War II, he said,
Okay.
I speak Hungarian, right?
Uh-huh.
Quite convenient, especially World War II. There was a huge backlash against Germans. And
Yeah.
it turns out that this guy's family, but this time is in California, they have a orchard. So they run an orchard.
Hmm.
And I found a newspaper article that talked about how the police went in and trashed and broke up his illegal still.
Whoa.
This was during Prohibition.
Oh.
Yes.
Huh.
So it's kind of interesting, and a lot of that stuff happened to a lot of German-speaking
Mm.
people because of this, anti-German sentiment that was around during that
Wow.
time. So that's just one example of how this all kind of fit together. But I knew about languages in contact. I knew about multilingualism. I was able to look up, right, the language policies of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Two, emperors, two languages. They had to write a whole bunch of policy about what language was going to be used for what. And that helped me to figure out whether to be searching the documents in German or Hungarian. Turns out I found this guy's baptism record from this Catholic church in this tiny town in what's today Eastern Austria, in the town called Groß-Petersdorf, right, in German, that that baptism record I found in the Hungarian archives in Budapest under the Hungarian name of that town, which was called San Michael, St. Michael. So totally different names, right?
Huh.
Big Peterstown versus St. Michael.
So were you going
And
town by town, searching for his records? You kind of knew.
no, I didn't know what town to look for. It's really hard when I don't, try not to do needle in a haystack type searching unless I absolutely have to. So I knew he was from that general area, but there are hundreds of towns.
Yeah.
And so what caught me about that was understanding the geopolitics, understanding the language policies that come from geopolitical forces, and then going, okay, so let's see, we all know, right, the power of naming. And when your language is dominant, you name things in your language.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what that's what led me into going, well, what was the name of the town in this other language?
Yeah. And I know a big part of your work then is to work with the people who, are connected to this ancestor then to broaden their own awareness about like geopolitical
Yes,
turmoil
that's part of
or
my mission.
yeah.
So that's where the activism of my linguistics work with the Language and Heritage Institute kind of fits in with the mission of Chronos Heritage Services. So I always say that Chronos Heritage Services is all about engendering empathy for people who are affected, and I usually will say families who are affected over several generations by some of the mass events that occur historically. And by mass events, I mean things like wars that cause huge migration. We all know that migration and immigration is connected very carefully with language, right? And languages in contact. And so, and heritage languages for that. And so by helping people to understand that their own families were shaped by some of these often tragic events, in the 20th century, we have plenty of them. So let's just go with, the two world wars, for example. That's enough.
Mm-hmm.
And we can really say, okay, given all the migration that, happened as a result of those two wars, your family is very likely affected. And if I can what I hope is that I help you to think about how you are interacting with those same issues today. So when you see a news article about, Syrian refugees landing in Italy or Greece or whatever it may be, maybe you'll have an opinion because you will have felt something for your own ancestors in that kind of situation.
Mm.
And that's where that activism comes out again.
I love it. I'm struck by, I'm remembering you telling a story about when you were teaching this past semester, how you had organized a lesson around a place that was like a town plaza,
Mm-hmm.
and you were having your students all kind of trace the things that had happened in that spot.
Yeah.
And I know you also do walking tours too.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So I brought all those things together. So this is an example of how, as a multi-potential, I search for ways of connecting all of these threads. So what I did was I was teaching intro to linguistics, and most people might say, oh, that's a boring class to teach. It's actually fascinating because you get to do all kinds of creative projects with your students. So the creative project that I did with my students is I took them to this plaza in Northern California, where that happens to be the locus of several really important historical events for the history of the region. One of those events is what we call the Bear Flag Revolt, which is when California was a republic for a very few days before the U.S. sent its warships over and said, oh, Mexico can't control its population. They've had a revolt, so we're going to install martial law and support this republic. Anyway, everybody knows my opinion about the Bear Flag Revolt now. That was the first one. The second event there was that there was a mission established in that place. It's the northernmost mission of Spanish, and then later this one was actually under Mexican rule. So there was a great deal of basically what I would call enslavement of Native Americans. And if people are familiar with the mission system, there was this three-pronged effort, right? Bring in the soldiers, and then after bring in civilians to work the land, and then bring in the church to convert the Native Americans. Who's going to be working the land and who's going to be doing all of that work to then create what was the most important trade at the time, which was cowhides. They called cowhides California dollars at the time. So that was a mission. If you go to Mission San Francisco de Solano, which is in this place in the Sonoma Plaza, there isn't much there today except what was the former, what they call servants' quarters, right? And so you get to see how, what I would consider the enslaved people lived at that time. So the mission system was there. And then the third most important thing was the Mexican barracks of the northernmost post of the Mexican barracks was there under the leadership of General Francisco Vallejo, or I can't remember his first name now, but Vallejo. And so all of these events occurred in this spot. They're all very important. I brought the students in to do a linguistic landscape study. We looked at all of the linguistic landscapes. And then I actually it was just a small group of students that volunteered to do this. They produced walking tours in Spanish, and then they helped to advertise and say they would also translate these walking tours into English. So we were making a point about the languages that kind of are layered in that area, right? The Native American languages, the Spanish, the English, and today it's even more diverse than that. And we were translating into English on some of our walking tours and making them available, limited availability in English translation. And of course, this was all disrupted by COVID-19 and sheltering in. And so the best that we did was we started the project, and these were students who were volunteering, right, to do this, who I happen to have a lot of Spanish speaking students in the intro to linguistics class. So we created this script where people could walk from point to point and listen to audio summary of the historical events given from the perspective of Native Americans, of other minority people that could be, for example, like a Mexican soldier in the barracks, or from somebody who was, you know, missionized, like a
Phenomenal.
Native American who was missionized. So we created these audio tours kind of to tell the alternative history that doesn't get told in these different spots. This was, you know, an intro to linguistics class.
Yeah.
And some people would say, well, that's getting really far away from linguistics, but these issues of
Let's get
language and
into it.
power and, you
That's
know,
what students want to do. That's what I mean, I propose that that's what the students that I talk
they
to,
got into it.
yeah, they
And
want
then,
to.
you know, I could reinforce stuff. I could say, well, what you see there, right, is, and then I could say, look, that's a morpheme, because remember what a morpheme is. So, I mean, I could bring it back to our curriculum, so to speak, but yeah, really connecting it to real world issues,
Yeah.
right? And I think it is important to say that many of the students who are Spanish speaking, they're Spanish speaking because they have a shared heritage with the same people that we are trying, whose voices we're trying to bring out in this project.
Yeah.
And so that's an important thing to also point out.
So in this series, I talk with a lot of people who, you know, have carved out, you know, career paths for themselves that are an expression of their own unique interests and values and training. What would you say to, you know, I think a lot of people that watch the series are themselves trying to think about forging their own path or doing their own, you know, exploration. What would you say to them? Um, and maybe this has to do with how you have been finding, you know, how you've been
Mm-hmm.
finding your way.
I went really, this was a long journey of trial and error, but I would say that the big thing was I found my way by starting with my values. Like, what do I care about?
Hmm,
And you can tell by the stories that I'm telling, right?
right.
That there are a few things that I really care about. I care about immigration issues. That's a big thing that I care about. And I care about the language policy issues that come as a result of immigration issues. So I care about language access. I care about language rights. For example, you know, indigenous rights, indigenous language rights, having access to translation services, interpretation services.
Hmm,
I care very much about access to information in your language. So I think that a multilingual society would be a more productive society, that we would have more people that are participating in our civic life, and
yeah.
that would actually improve the standard of living for so many people. And I'm speaking regionally because I think it's important to recognize where you live. And I happen to live in California, which is a very diverse state, and in which immigration is a major issue. So that's just an example of like one thing that I care about that kind of has a seed through everything that I do.
Yeah.
Start with
I've
what you care about.
I've been playing with the metaphor of a set of constellations in the night sky. That this is kind of, as you're doing your own informational interviewing and you're looking at job applications and you're kind of trying to think about projects that you've done in the past and trying to map out how all of that, you know, makes sense. Um, I like the idea of thinking about that as stars in the night sky, because you kind of have to have a lot of them before you can start seeing
Before you start to see the constellations.
and figure out where you are.
I mean, yes, you can make a constellation out of 3 stars, but you have to have a lot more imagination.
And I think one of my favorite entailments out of that is the idea of the North Star. Like, so you had a North Star, you know,
Mm-hmm.
all of these are points, but there's one that is like a really big one that has
Mm-hmm.
been, you know, kind of front and center for you.
Yeah. And as long as I'm with, I mean, I do kind of, I navigate that way, actually, to take this metaphor even
Yeah.
further, right? I navigate that way. So one of the things that happens is that because I love a lot of things, I find myself taking on projects here and there and doing things really far down the road. And sometimes I have to say to myself, okay, I've taken on too much. A lot of us do this.
Yeah.
All what is going to be the criteria by which I eliminate or say no to?
Yeah. I love it.
And one of the ways I do that is saying, does it fit into what I care about?
Mm-hmm. I
And
like that a lot.
can I add something too
Yeah,
about for advice for people who are
of course.
finishing and are thinking about what to do? So whether or not a person's going to stay in academia or not, or don't know, right? I didn't know, so I was kind of on the fence. Like either way, wasn't sure as I finished. And so many people think, and I thought this too, that I had absolutely no skills for doing anything except getting a position in another Spanish department or a linguistics department and doing sociocultural research,
Right.
which I still do, right? But it was a very narrow idea, and then I have to teach these classes, and that's all I do. And the problem with that is that it's very short-sighted.
Yeah.
Just take, for example, the fact that you have written a dissertation. If your dissertation involved any sort of ethnographic research, you have handled a long-term project in which you have had to plan. So now you're a project manager. You had to plan. If you interviewed people, you had to actually manage the schedules of other people in order to, work with them. You had to leverage your relationships. And by that, I mean, this is a business term, right? Leveraging relationships means using relationships that you have with people in order to get what you want. And this is not necessarily a negative thing, although it could be used negatively too. Like, I know you, so can you give me this? But
Yeah.
I know you, so maybe we can create
How a lot
something
of stuff gets
positive
done
out of this, right?
Yeah.
And that's how work gets done everywhere, also in academia, right?
Right.
When you collaborate with somebody on research, or you want to get funding for XYZ project,
Yeah.
you are leveraging your relationships. Don't ignore all these other skills that are necessary in your future and that translate from what you've already done. You have created something, your dissertation. You have, you have research skills. You have writing skills.
Probably management skills.
Huge management skills. That's what I'm getting at with this project management thing. So
Not just project management too, but like personnel management.
Oh yeah.
Even if it's just managing your committee.
Yes. We could talk about our committee members as subcontracted employment, sure.
Well, I mean, in the business world, they talk a lot about managing up. Like if you know how to help your manager manage you, that is a major selling point.
You are onto that. Yep, that is definitely true. That is most certainly true. So I think that a lot of people don't know how to rewrite those skills in the language that the person who would be reading their resume, and we're talking now not a CV, right? A resume.
Yep.
How a person reading that resume would want to see that person. You have skills.
And I think conversely, or complementarily, people have limited views of their own, the transferability of their own skills. But I think people who've been in academia for a long time may also have inherited certain perceptions about the misperceptions, I would say, about the world outside of academia, right? That it's going to be deadly dull. It's going to be boring. There's not going to be a way that I can be, as curious or as smart or as, and I would be curious to know what your experience has been of that.
Well, I can say studying the language policy of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, writing up the history of this family, and taking this family. I actually took this family to Austria, Hungary, and Serbia in 2019.
Wow.
And that to me is not boring.
No.
Did it require an incredible amount of tedious research? Yes. I put in the research hours. Did I have to cite my sources? Yes. Right? But I've been trained to do that kind of stuff.
Right.
So I mean, I kind of enjoy research work.
Well,
If you
yeah.
don't enjoy research work, don't go into genealogy. But a lot of us who are coming from academia, we know how to do the research work, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not boring. I don't know. Even having the institute's not boring.
For me, it was something I had to learn again and again, that just had been a misperception, that I was never going to be challenged outside of, the academic context.
Oh, I'm challenged much more than I would, than I was when I was a faculty member in many ways. When money is on the line, when your own livelihood is on the line, when your reputation, right, with clients is on the line, that's a pretty big motivation. I would say those are challenges.
Yeah. Oh, that's wonderful. Well, if people want to know more about you, Serena, what's the best way for them to learn about?
Well, they can learn about the Chronos Heritage Services and the Language and Heritage Institute from the websites, but people can also contact me and just talk to me if they want to. Send me an email. So,
what would be the best way for them? Email is your preference?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I will share that in the show notes. Thank you
Fantastic.
so much for making yourself available, Serena. It means a lot. And I know a lot of students, I share your story and people find it really inspiring. It gives a creative spark to other people to see someone using their creative spark,
Mm-hmm. I hope so. I'm having fun.
That's awesome. It's fun to know you, that's for sure. Thanks, Serena.
Thank you, Anna Marie.
Have a great long weekend.
You too.
Here's to what's next.